Welcome to today's webcast, hosted by the American Petroleum Institute. In this webcast, you will hear directly from industry experts on API-recommended Practice 2D operation and maintenance of offshore cranes. We'll go into details about lift planning, personal training, inspection, testing, and maintenance, as well as temporary crane installation. You'll also learn about the new changes from the 6th to the 7th edition of API RP2D. Our first presentation is Maintenance and Inspection for API RP2D, changes from the 6th to the 7th edition, given by Wilfred J.R. Guidry. J.R. is currently acting as competent lead for Sparrows U.S. and has been employed in the oil industry since 1963.
4 years. I think we've been working on this for 4 years. It's finally out. There's a lot of changes in the document. Some reference words that are put in that weren't in previous. Okay, normative and informative were added to the annexes, which were previously not in there. Most of the other API documents contain those terms. Just a wording change. Previous editions only referred to pedestal-mounted, bottom-supported, or floating vessels used in drilling and production operations. There's some changes added to this document to include shipboard applications, lifting devices 5 tons or more mounted on service-type vessels, heavy lift applications, cranes used in heavy lift, barges, self-elevating vessels, or other vessels used in construction and salvage operations. Davits, launch frames not included in this scope of this recommended practice, so those are not involved in it. We added something in there to kind of cover some of these actions. Lifting devices not covered by this document shall be operated, inspected, and maintained according to the manufacturer recommendations. A lot of these smaller lifting devices that people consider cranes, and we've got a definition for cranes, they don't think you have to do an inspection on them. Well, everything needs some type of inspection. That's why the manufacturer documents are important. We added a crane. There never has been a basic description of a crane. Some of the terminology was, well, it's not really a crane, it's a maintenance device. Well, a crane is any power-operated equipment that can hoist, lower, slew, or horizontally move a suspended load. So it's pretty well describing what a crane actually is. Derate's always been in there, but we added some wording in there. Why you derate something? To reduce the capacity because of damage, deterioration of a critical component. So it'd have to be something to why you derate a crane. So there was discussion during these years of trying to get this document in place, trying to figure out exactly when we get to words, what does it mean, why we have it in there. So that's why a lot of the terms were added, but there were some descriptive terms added to it. In service can be, as long as the crane is capable of operating in a safe manner, can be with the boom in the air or in the boom rest. Either way, it still can be in service. Out of service is when it's not capable of operating in a safe manner. It can be in the air or in the rest, neither one of them. It could be either way. Ed Zerang went through the lifting authority in his presentation, but I think it's a little bit more involved in lifting authority that people are not going to realize. It's going to be a certificated person. A PIC appoint somebody as a lifting authority. That doesn't mean that if there's an incident, who's going to determine what his qualifications are. I think there's going to be some specialized training involved in that lifting authority process. Like I say, it's in there for a reason, and I think it's going to be a boost as far as a lot of these lifts, having somebody on location, especially for the heavy lifts. Static and dynamic, all the older cranes all had static charts in it. I mean, what is it, 95 are required to have a dynamic chart. Well, a lot of the old operators, they have some of the older cranes. Now they want onboard chart and offboard charts. Not really required until the 6th and the 7th edition when you had floating vessels. Static and dynamic, all is required on a older generation crane. So just as that emphasis, we added static, onboard, dynamic, and offboard to kind of give us a guide. Basically, it's not always onboard and offboard is required. C.2.4, JSA shall be conducted when doing any personnel lift. That was added to it, basically to ensure that the person getting on that basket is on the JSA and he's aware of what's happening. Big topic, load test. Presently, the only requirements by API is it has to be on a new crane, relocated crane, or temporary crane. It's the only time a load test is required. The crane load test is not required to determine the fitness of repairs or alterations. Some of the representatives that came to some of the meetings, they want to have a load test on any critical component that was replaced. Then the flag started coming up as, okay, you're changing the dead end on a crane. It's a critical component. It's all right, so you have 400 cranes. You're gonna do a load test on every crane. You're gonna change the dead end. And we kind of left that as, well, we're not gonna go to that area. That's up to the owner to determine if they want to do a load test. It's up to the owner. They own the crane, so they can make the call. But it's not required for a critical component. We've had instances where you have a crane operator that's pretty sharp. He knows that crane will not pass a load test. So you're sitting in a crane and you're looking at a dyno. Crane operator's pulling a load. You're trying to verify that it'll hold the load. The crane operator he's just holding the boom hoist control or the hoist control in because he knows the lift cylinder's leaking or the winch is slipping, so that he can fool that inspector. We add it in there, make sure the lever's in the neutral position. Just as to make sure that the crane will pass, not the operator passing the crane. On load testing, a live weight load test shall be performed on initial and temporary installations, basically the water bags or steel weights, anything live weights, not deck pulling. The load be swung in all directions that the crane is operated to avoid obstructions. Another portion of it is shall be raised and lowered to demonstrate the hoist will function properly and test the static brakes. If it can't handle the load, if it can't lower it, can't hoist it, can't hold the load once you go into neutral, it's not really going to pass the test. Crane usage categories, infrequent use categories, the only thing you have to do is a pre-use now and an annual on an infrequent use. It's the only things required. Now, if it's sitting more than 3 months, you have to do a monthly inspection, go through a complete full function test of the crane during that period. Welding repairs. Crane shall be re-rated and load charts revised in accordance with the addition of API 2C in effect at the original equipment date of manufacturer. So basically, you don't have to go to 7th edition for a crane that you're doing any repairs to. It just goes back to the edition that it was designed or built to. Whenever a load chart, a derated load chart is put on a crane, it must be by a qualified source, and there should be a documentation of the duration of that chart. It's 30, 45, 90 days, whatever that duration period is, so that you don't have a crane sitting over there for a year. It's got a derated load chart on it. It was derated for a reason. Why? And how long is that chart good for? What came out of it was a crane owner shall develop and implement a written policy for wire open sling inspection, lubrication, maintenance, and replacement. The crane owner. Crane owner also, that policy indicates who, when, the dimensional measurements, type of lubrication, the amount of lubrication, how it's applied, and the method of lubrication, and the method of application. How is it being greased? How is it maintained? Section 6 of the wire rope requirements also do not apply to rigging. The little anti-two-block cables that hold up the valves or the weights, it's not required to have a certificate or a pull test or proof test on that sling. It's just a piece of equipment. It's not required to have that certificate on it. But it shall be included as part of the periodic inspection program. So a lot of people miss it, checking them little items, you know, the shackles and also the cables. That's part of the inspection process. Basically a baseline dimension. You put the wire on, work a little bit, get a baseline dimension of that wire rope and document it. There's no nominal dimensions in this part of the running ropes or standing rope procedure. We don't measure 0.750, we measure the actual dimension, and that's recorded. No nominal dimensions. We took out Appendix D. Annex B, it's got hoist assemblies. Part of it is as far as for installing the hoist drive. We took that part of it out and added consult the crane manufacturer for the best procedure for testing the hoist and the swing parking brakes. Swing brake went in there before. We added the swing brake. A lot of people do not understand how to check a swing brake. They want to swing it, hit the brake. Oh, yeah, it works. But next time you know you're getting a wind, put the brake on, it doesn't hold. You have to actually power against a stalled brake to test it. It's the only way you can get a true test on the brake. See, if it tears up, it's junk. To test it properly, it has to be stalled out against that brake. Some more wire rope. Added high stranding to the terminology for high strand on wire rope. Basically, people understand that there is a issue with high stranding. That whole high strand is not actually working. It's a dead rope. All the dimensions on the wire rope that for wear limitations, they all stay the same. In the document, for 3/32, the 2.4 millimeter, actually the document states 0.8 millimeter, which is wrong. But all the terminology as far as for the dimensional wear limitation stays the same. We added in there for 1.5-inch rope a 5% dimensional loss from the baseline measurement. The wire rope terminations in 95, they changed it to where you don't have to saddle you don't have to saddle a dead horse anymore. Well, that was always our terminology. You don't saddle a dead horse. Well, it's back in now. Where all this part of it here, you can saddle a dead horse. You can do it either way. So that whole process, basically this wasn't in there before. We added that back in there, so you can saddle a dead horse now. Previous inspection. In the previous documents, I think the 5th and the 6th edition both, the item number 6 was do a walk-around inspection. And most people set up their inspection criteria as far as pre-use according to the document, basically A, B, C, and D. We took and we performed a walk-around inspection up to the top, because most people, when they get on the crane, they're not getting back off to doing a pre-use inspection and walk-around. So that we thought that should be put up top, basically, so that you do that pre-use first. That's the first thing you do before you get on the crane. We also added in there to verify the operation of the boom hoist and anti-tube block. That wasn't in the pre-use inspection for years. It was in there for the quarterly inspection. Okay, so if you have an infrequent use category, it'll use less than 10 hours per month based on a quarterly average. It never was done until you did the annual. So in theory, it wasn't required to check the anti-tube block or the boom hoist kickout. We wanted it in there. We added in there the annual inspection to include the weight indicator system for verification. It's not required per API that you have a load indicating system on a crane. But if you do have it, verified, do the increments, basically 5, 10, 15, 20,000 pounds, basically compare it with a calibrated dynamometer to make sure that load indicating system is working. I don't know if anybody that's going to send in a Martin Decker unit every year to get it recalibrated. Basically, the only time they do it is if it starts leaking. Check it occasionally. Make sure that the function is there, that it does operate in some manner, in increments. Okay, here's nominal diameter again. Nominal diameters did not show up on running ropes. The only time it's in the document is for slings, and that's just to verify if they have a decrease in diameter. We back up on wire rope. There's no statement in there on running ropes that if the wire rope increases that you have a warning sign. I think we still think people as a qualified inspector should have enough common sense to realize that when stuff starts getting bigger, something's not right. Whereas a sling, you can kind of bend it around. If it stays in one position, you know it's junk. Yesterday, one of the, I think the guy from Besso made a statement about ownership. And I think that's one of the biggest things is people do not take ownership anymore in the practice of basically operation, rigging, inspection. People just want to just pencil whip an inspection. The part ownership, I think, is the big thing that I needed to bring it up earlier, but it didn't. But it's probably one of the things that people should understand is ownership is basically an important part, is people understand that they are responsible. Thank you.
Next up is David Landry, presenting on temporary cranes from API RP2D, covering changes from the 6th to the 7th edition. David is a crane foreman, employed with Fieldwood Energy LLC, and has been working in the offshore oil industry since 1975.
We're going to talk about the changes between API RP2D 6th edition and 7th edition for temporary cranes. Temporary crane installation. The temporary crane section has gained some major additions to this section of the RP. Previously, this section was Appendix I, and it was a half a page long. This section is no longer an appendix. It is now chapter or section 9 of the RP2D 7th edition, and is now 5+ pages. All the sections in the temporary crane installation cover temporary crane installation, the planning and the installation, installing the temporary cranes, testing and inspecting the installation, the usage, crane design, crane equipment, load test requirements, preventive maintenance, work history, rental checklist, tie-down weld design, torque procedure, load test procedures, inspection of temporary cranes after the installation. Planning the installation. For the most part, this section includes entire temporary crane section from RP to the 6th edition with some additions. Important addition is if the temporary crane manufacture date is unknown or does not have an API monogram, a design review shall be conducted by the crane owner in accordance with API 2C 3rd edition as a minimum. The qualified person shall ensure the adequate review of the following: platform design and condition, select the temporary crane, planned crane placement on the platform, crane base beams and sub-base beams and tie-down design, meet the safe working loads for the crane being installed, and critical components as defined in API 2C. 9.2 in 7 is no changes from 6. It's virtually the same, no changes, and also 9.3 testing, inspection, installation. The following are additions to the temporary crane section, RP2D 7th edition. The usage, crane design. Temporary cranes are frequently used for construction, maintenance, and or for installing equipment that the platform crane may be incapable of. They are not the permanent crane. Their fitness for purpose are more specifically identified in the task they are mobilized to address. The load rating should meet the criteria as described in the edition of API 2C in effect on the original manufacture date of the temporary crane. Crane design. The provider should submit if requested, documentation of design parameters for the crane that the crane was designed and manufactured to, the crane pedestal substructure base beams and all crane tie-downs connections should be designed in accordance with API 2A WSD. The provider should submit construction, substructure base beam, substructure to base beam connections, the base beam tie-down design for the crane, and certify that such design is performed by a qualified person and that such design is specific to the setup of the proposed crane at the proposed platform. Crane equipment. All cranes shall have anti-two-block devices on main and aux lines. The crane shall be equipped with boom high-angle limiting devices. The crane shall have a load indicator. The temporary crane provider shall supply emergency load lowering equipment when handling personnel. The temporary crane provider shall supply test certificates for the boom, main, and auxiliary hoist cable, wire rope, including the pendant lines, in accordance with 6.2 of 7 edition. Continuing with crane equipment, the crane should be equipped with emergency slew and swing capability. Access shall be provided to the boom for inspections on boom tip and two-block systems. Access to the location points, heliports, flare booms, whatever it may be, or boom walkways can be temporary. Load test requirements. Temporary crane providers shall perform load test of the temporary cranes in accordance with 4.7 and Annex D of this standard. Cranes shall be subjected to the appropriate inspections and load test after each rig up or relocation of cranes. When performing a dynamometer load test, temporary crane provider should furnish a properly calibrated dynamometer. It is suggested that the temporary crane provider submit a calibration certificate furnished by a third party. Function test of the temporary crane. Minimum should include rated load to water level and back up, slew swing with rated load in the quadrants of the lift performance. Preventive maintenance. The temporary crane provider shall inspect, maintain, repair, and document maintenance and repairs made in accordance with 5.1.3 Annex D. The temporary crane provider preventive maintenance and repair program shall be performed by a qualified person in accordance with 5.3. Temporary crane provider is responsible for all pre-use monthly, quarterly, and annual inspections of the crane except in bare rentals. Quarterly crane inspection shall be performed and documented by a qualified crane inspector designated by the temporary crane provider. Preventive maintenance continued. Pre-use and monthly crane inspections shall be performed and documented by a qualified crane operator. Documentation for all inspections should be submitted to the customer representative in accordance with 5.2.2 and 5.2.3 unless waived by the customer. The temporary crane documentation shall be kept by the crane owner for a period of 4 years and accessible upon request. Work history. A temporary crane provider should be prepared to submit a work history report for the proposed crane for the last 10 jobs or for all jobs in the last 12 months, whichever is shorter. Rental checklist. The temporary crane provider should submit the following information to the customer: layout of crane on platform drawings, crane sub-base beam drawings, crane base beam drawings, sub-base to base beam connections, base beam to platform tie-down design. Tie-down well design. The well design may be indicated on the tie-down drawings and will be. Torque procedures. A torque procedure should be submitted if the crane pedestal is attached to the structure via bolts, and the torque should be indicated in the plan. Welding procedures. All weld procedures should be submitted if the crane pedestal is attached to the structure via welding. And load test. Whenever a temporary crane is installed, a load test shall be performed in accordance with Annex D. Load test procedures. Pre-load test inspection is performed by a qualified inspector on the temporary crane. Perform pre-NDE and post-NDE on temporary crane tie-down welds. Perform load test on temporary cranes. The test load should be performed using the load test method with a live load. The initial load test should be lifted and moved in all the quadrants of operation when the facility configuration allows. Load test report should include, for both auxiliary and main lines, the actual test load, the actual test radius, indicated load, and the hydraulic hoist pressure. And check the radius of boom angle indicator at 4 values, including maximum and minimum. Inspection of temporary cranes after the installation should include pre-use inspection, monthly inspection, quarterly inspection, and the annual inspections. Usage on temporary cranes should be considered as heavy use category. That's what the changes have been and additions to APIRP to the 7th edition for temporary cranes.
Our third presentation on lift planning is provided by Ed Zarang. Ed has over 45 years of experience in the oil and gas industry.
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Ed Zarang. If safety is something you think about, then API RP2D Section 7 on lift planning is the area that is new to the industry and all the documentation required there. What's going to happen here is going back to the previous presentations I saw today. You take the lifting of the vessel. How many lift plans were done there? You take the presentation on all the incidents and accidents. Was there any lift planning done? So some of the things you might want to think about on previous presentations if lift plans were implemented. And it starts off here where prior to handling any load that's considered non-routine or repetitive in nature, a written lift plan should be developed. Communicated to all members of the lifting crew and follow. Hear the word communicated to all members. We've seen that rigor, incidents and accidents. Crane operator, incident accidents. It's a team takes the full responsibility because the team has failed if one accident happens amongst the team. So think about the team concept as we go through this. The complexity, example, verbal versus written. The amount of details will depend on the numerous factors. And of course, human factors, one of the big ones. You know, what's that person's knowledge, experience? What is his demeanor? How he acts? Another thing we don't think about is also we are global. We can have language barriers. Could be a problem. So think about all the numerous factors here. All right, what is the lift team, hear the word team's responsibility? Before the operation, wherever details, I can't go into all details here where that's going to cover, but you got to think about before the operation what we have to do, what we have to check off, what we have to check on, and make sure it's done. If a rigger's out there, he's the lowest man. He's looking up to the crane operator or people above for leadership. He's looking for help. We should be providing it to him and giving him the mentorship that he deserves to have. During the operation and after the operation. And don't forget, at any time during these operations, he has the power to do what? Stop without no repercussion. Person in charge, who can it be? Well, supervisors, managers, offshore installation managers, tool pusher. But the person in charge has the overall responsibility of the work, activities. The person recognizes or is advised of the need for a lifting activity, either notifies the lifting authority, which we're going to cover here in a few minutes, who that person is. He'll appoint the lifting authority to plan the lifting operation. So you see we're starting to get some kind of procedure or process here. Here we're going to talk about the lifting authority, what his responsibility or what he should be doing. He supervises lifting operations. He should have practical skills, theoretical knowledge, ability to carry out risk assessment, to procedures and assess lift plans, conduct pre-lift meetings, or toolbox talk. The lifting authority may or may not supervise the lifting operation, but he's the focal point of the lift or the technical operation. He's the focal point. Examples of the lift team could be tech support, giving you technical information to perform the lift. Put this sling right here on this pad eye and this pad eye. Might be specific areas you might have to attach to do a lift to keep it balanced. Crane operator, vessel captain, rigger. But you look at all that, look up on top what it says. Team members. We're all a team. We all have to work together. We all have to understand each other and see what each other's needs are and responsibilities. To plan the lift, we got to take into consideration lift categorization, which I'll go into a little bit more detail as we go a little further here. The lift categorization has to be determined. Is it a heavy lift, or is it a simple lift? Is it complex? Is it critical? Some people might look at personnel lift as being critical because it's involving personnel. We can hurt somebody. Risk assessments, training and competent personnel. Do we have trained and competent personnel to perform this task? Now, at some points, you got to provide training. And somebody's going to come in as an SSE, short service employee. When he comes in SSE, should we identify that person as not having knowledge? So maybe he might be an observer at this task, because we got to get him trained eventually. We got to get him up that ladder to be experienced. So let's go back to one of the previous things when they say rig about position. Well, that guy just sitting there watching should be in a position of what? Safety, huh? And he also, everybody should know their escape route, huh? Okay? Documentation. What required documentation will require? Do we have a pre-use done? Do we have to have permit the works, JSAs? What documentation required to perform this task? Has to be all laid out and covered and filled out. The approval of the lift plan. Okay, at the end we did all this, we got to get approval, huh? Somebody's going to read all this. I hope it's just as knowledgeable as the team that put this together, so he can identify any wrongs, huh? Changes to the lift plan. Is he going to make any kind of changes to the lift plan? And sometimes if you make a change to the lift plan has to be done what? All over again, huh? And it has to be communicated all over again. Lift categorization is going to fall into two categories: routine lifts, and it's getting to the point where what is routine? And non-routine lifts. And non-routine lifts can be divided into other three categories: simple, complicated, complex, and critical. Each category requires a different level of documentation and control based on complexity and potential severity. We're going to get to a section what's called Appendix G or Annex G, which in the back of API RP2D will aid you or help you to identify different categories and these types of lifts. You already might have a plan that categorizes. You might have different terminology. That's all right, it's acceptable. As long as it shows what? Increased risk, increased documentation, and increased skills. The lift will be categorized, planned, and carried out according to appropriate documentation. Again, the documentation, like a permit to work, JSA, is required. This is what the Annex G I was talking about. Describes some typical categories of lifting operation according to the level of risk and complexity. The owners and operator may have their own terminology, as I mentioned earlier. That's fine. As long as it reflects what? Increasing risk and increasing level of control. Risk assessment. Every lifting operation should be risk assessed by the lifting authority before work begins. The lifting authority should ensure that appropriate controls are in place, those hazards identified in the written assessment, such that risks are managed as an integral part of a lift plan. So remember, he's got to identify all the risks involved, right? Suitable risk documentation, risk assessment, such that risks are managed as an integral part of a lift plan. A suitable documented risk assessment may already exist. You might have already developed a plan, and it's called generic, but that doesn't mean you just keep using the generic over and over again. It should be what? Reevaluate for its applicability. You have to look at it and say, well, maybe the weather has changed. Maybe because I got a crew working over there, now I got to go what? Communicate with that crew, letting them know there's a lift path. That was mentioned earlier, wasn't it? Lift path, huh? Is part of your lift plan, huh? Are we going to be over any environmental concerns? Are we going to hit something, bump something? Are we lifting over personnel? If any significant changes are required to the existing assessment, for example, there are additional risks not accounted for, a new risk assessment should be developed. So if somebody might come out the blue, hey, we forgot this. Then we got to do what? Another risk lift plan assessment all over again. This is a little example here, like a crane operator while transferring personnel between vessels and vessels to the platform shall raise the personnel carrier only high enough on the deck to clear all obstructions. He's going to swing the personnel carrier over the water, raise and lower in such a manner to minimize swings, position it slightly above the landing, and gently lower to the deck. Well, that's giving you some steps, huh? Can we add to that? Well, certainly. Because your policy might have more to it, huh? Regulatory might have more, whatever. The manufacturer might have something to add to that, huh? Process. All this has to be put together to make your lift plan. Owners and operators should identify the standards required for critical roles and process for establishing and verifying qualifications, those involved in planning and executing the lift operation. So we're looking at personnel qualification now. Let's say that I fill out a logbook. I'm just picking that, okay? And I say, well, as long as he does 70% of it, that's good enough. We got a good understanding. But the other 30%, he has not performed yet. You better know what that 30% is, because if you put him on a task that's on that 30% that he's not performed yet, remember, he has not done it. And if something happens, that will come back to say he has not performed that task. Personnel carriers should be designed and in conditions suitable for the intended purpose and maintained and inspected according to the manufacturer specifications. Also see Annex C, informative. That's, in other words, give me more information for additional information on personnel transfer. qualified personnel to facilitate training records should be readily available, if practical, on the person. That's a lot of documentation, huh? Only qualified personnel is involved in lifting operation. We got to train. He's an SSE. Think about that. The following should be elements of a lift plan. You got to have a written plan, a lift plan, huh? You got to have a safety checklist. You know, what are you going to check off? Now, I didn't cover everything in the API RP2D, but there's a lot, 30, 40 items there to check through to see if everything is correct. Remember, it's a team. I hope the crane operator is doing his job. I hope the PIC is doing his job. The lift plan, the rigger knows his job, because all of us is working as a unit. Drawings, risk assessment, JSAs is all part of the lift planning. Drawings, like, you know, is there environmental considerations have to be taken in consideration when the load is going from one location, say point A to point Z? What environmental catastrophe can happen? Is there something we can hit or disrupt? Is there people in the way? It's a crane in working condition, huh? You can see the little guy there saying, I can save money by running this rope till Friday. That was Wednesday when he said it, huh? But Thursday came, and what happened? He didn't make it to Friday. Toolbox talk, communications, and permit to work. Toolbox talks, you can call it a safety meeting or whatever you want to call it there. All lift plans should be reviewed and approved by lifting authority. The rigor of the review should be determined by the category of the lift, which can require engineering specialists, huh? So we're going to get approval or disapproval, and it might require engineering more input. Changes to the, is there any changes should, you know, to the plan? You know what changes do, it just kills us all. We don't like changes. Nobody likes changes. Some questions you can ask. Is there a new existing plan which is adequate for the lifting operation? Has a risk assessment been undertaken at the risk management through the control measures within the lift plan? Is equipment selected fit for purpose and identified in the lift plan? Do personnel selected to undertake this lifting operation have the correct level of experience and competency? Got to make sure of that. Has the steps of the lift plan been communicated and understood by all involved? Again, the team, huh? What could go wrong? Have you thought of everything? Have you conveyed that information? And has it been put into your lift plan? What can go wrong? And if something goes wrong, do you have an emergency plan? Do you have an emergency escape route? All that goes into your lift plan. Has all the potential affected parties been informed of the lifting activities? That means everybody. Because you know, when you have a lot of activities going on, a lot of companies coming in, doing jobs, they're all over the place like busy bees. Are we going to affect each other or get in the way of each other? So you got to communicate all that to them. So, in end here, I like to say, we have too much to do to sit on the sideline. Let's do it together. We heard what we have to do. We've seen what we need to do. Now is the time to do it. And together we can do it. Remember, change and growth takes place when a person dares to become involved. Thank you.
Next up is Brandon Bollinger, speaking on the new API RP 2D training requirements. Brandon is president of Gulf Crane Services and has 25 years of professional experience in the offshore industry.
As everybody knows, the API 2D was, of course, taken about 5 years to write. The 7th edition from the 6th edition, we started it, and we had about 4 to 5 subcommittees, and I happened to be, ended up taking over the training. So we're going to get straight into the slides. The 6th edition has approximately 4 pages of training information and requirements. Currently, the 7th edition has 30-plus pages of information and training requirements. And that was a major difference, of course, and I'm going to break down some of those differences as we go. Definition of a qualified rigger: anyone who attaches or detaches loads or loose gear to lifting devices. That did not change. Rigger qualifications. The employee shall verify and document the qualified rigger is responsible for the safe operation of using slings and rigging hardware and aware of their responsibility as SRP. To ensure the safe use of slings and rigging hardware, it is necessary that the qualified rigger have training, knowledge about slings and rigging hardware, has demonstrated a satisfactory skill level, and has the experience to consider it qualified in accordance with this RP. These were some notables that stayed the same. The crane load rigging shall only be performed by a qualified rigger. The employer shall ensure that rigger qualifications are maintained a minimum of every 4 years. We did discuss that in deep detail. Could we do a 2-year refresher? We stayed with the 4 years on that issue. The employee should verify that the employee has no history of disabling medical condition, which can be sufficient reason for disqualification. A lot of issues around that as well, and of course we left that up to the employer to be responsible for that. That's not something that the training company either had to do, but the employer had to be responsible for that. Rigger training assessment. The rigger hands-on assessment is added to the most to ensure the competence and qualification of the employee, going from 1 page of requirements to 14. So where we saw the biggest issue, of course, was we only had 3 pages, so there wasn't a lot to go by, and there was many people involved in this, Ed Zerang and several others that had been even working on the IADC, and so they had kind of started tasks, and I'm going to show y'all some of those here in the slides to come. So the rigger ended up having tasks that we added in, and I gave an idea of what the tasks looked like. Task 1, pre-lifting hardware and sling inspection. Wire rope slings, complete inspection, 5 steps. Synthetic slings, 5 steps. Shackles and complete inspection, 5 steps. Hook complete inspection. Load block complete inspection. This has changed from the 6 due to each step being a pass or fail checklist, and this is in the 7th edition. Task 2, a rigging hitch exercise, vertical hitches, complete inspection and hook up 17 steps. So again, each of them had 17 steps under the choker hitch and the basket hitch. 2 and 4 part bridle slings, complete inspections and hook, and they had 18 steps. Task 3, there's a lot of discussion around how the rigger communicates to the crane operator. We talked about that, hand signals, radio optional. We had looked at even making radio something that was required, but we left it optional. The designated signal person shall have the opportunity at the start of this task to discuss any special hand signals. One thing that we also did, if there was not a boom retract or scope in or out that had been taken out, and we added that back into the hand signals. Verify the hand signal chart is posted. Again, that's supposed to be posted on the crane. The student will be asked to respond or verbally describe 5 or more of these standard signals. That was some kind of a minimum. We also came up with a cards specifically, so everybody was doing different types of cards. So we came up with a standard card that could be utilized under rigger, crane operator, and crane inspector. This is the front of the card for rigger training. There were some questions about certificate because we mentioned certificate and card, and we did not put a copy of the certificate or what a certificate should look like. But if you would take naturally the same content that would be on the card, you could make a certificate, same deal. So we did mention that in 2D, but we did not show an example of the certificate, just the card, in case that was a question for somebody. Now, crane operator training, definition of a qualified crane operator. Qualified crane operator is one who is so designated by the employer who has appropriate offshore experience and training. Such appropriate experience and training must comprise minimum amounts of classroom type and field training on cranes specific to the types of the crane to be operated by the qualified operator. I'm going to show you a couple slides that talk about different types of cranes. It was mentioned in some of the older editions. He mentioned mechanical cranes, mentioned electrical, but it never was specific that you had to be trained on the type of crane. So we did change that as well in the 7th edition from the 6th. A student must present a valid rigger card to be an instructor. You can't be a crane operator without being a rigger. So you had to have a rigger card to be able to be a crane operator. A lot of questions. Do you have to do those two courses together? No, you don't. You can do a rigger course and then get your crane operator course later. Most people do rigger and crane operator together, but you don't have to. The student employer shall provide proof of compliance with the physical requirements. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide or two. The physical requirements did not change. Hands-on training shall be done. This was a change on the similar type of crane to be operated by the qualified operator in order to allow them to demonstrate their ability. Here's the physical requirements. That has not changed. Have vision of at least 20/30 Snellen in one eye and 20/50 Snellen in the other, with or without glasses, and have depth perception. Be able to distinguish red, green, and yellow regardless of position of color if differentiation is required for crane operation. Have hearing with or without hearing aid adequate for the specific operation. Have no history of disabling medical condition, which may be sufficient for disqualification. We also added, which I'll show you when we get to the card, that we added that did they need eyeglasses to be able to operate, because we felt like that was kind of being slipped, so we didn't know if a guy needed eyeglasses or not. And a lot of discussion around how do you check, how do you verify that all these physical requirements are met. Again, it's up to the employer to verify that this is done. It's up to the operator to have something in place to verify that the employer is doing the physical requirements. A lot of discussion around that. Notice it stayed the same. No one other than a qualified operator should operate the crane. The employer shall assure the crane operator qualifications are maintained at a minimum of 4 years. Through requalification, this should also include current vision medical. Again, like the rigger, we had several people pitch, should we go 2-year requalifications on crane operators or riggers? The group decided that we were going to stay at 4 years. So that meaning that if you go through crane operator training, you have to get it done every 4 years, according to 2D. Crane operator training on types of crane. This RP shall be filed to qualified crane operator for either 2 crane types and or subtypes. Operation of a non-mechanical crane, which we considered hydraulic or electric. Hands-on proficiency is the last segment of the crane. It should be held on a similar type of crane to be operated. The other type of crane was a mechanical or a friction crane. There's several still friction cranes in the Gulf of Mexico, so it had to be specific to the type, whether it be a Manitowoc or a link belt or a unit crane. Same with the electrical, you had to be specific. So this was a lot of question around how are you going to do that. Well, you can't train on the crane if you don't have that crane to be able to do the hands-on. So, that gets a little difficult in a company that may just have a hydraulic crane trying to do electrical crane training. You're going to have to be specific to the type of crane. So, crane operator training continues. Mechanical or non-mechanical cranes to be operated. Necessary experience and the training shall be focused on each type of crane, shall be more intense on mechanical for than non-mechanical due to the greater skills required to safely operate mechanical cranes. Again, I think we had seen some accidents in the past that tied to people operating mechanical cranes with friction swings, clutches, and a lot of those cranes have been replaced. But there are still a good many link belts and unit cranes, and there are Manitowocs out there as well that we're aware of. So, pre-use and the training shall document and ensure that practical exercises include the following: pre-use inspection, swing, crane, and control the load, performance of at least 3 unique types of lifts. This was a lot of discussion around it, that they had to perform a static lift, a dynamic lift, and a blind lift. Now, questions on that, if you're not on a floating, water, how you do a dynamic. We were specific in that you needed to be able to understand that on the load chart. There could be a lot of questions about why'd y'all put it in there. Well, because you need to understand the difference in a static and a dynamic and a blind lift. Of course, blind lift's very simple, but a lot of questions around that. It is portrayed to mean that you have a way during the class to be able to differentiate the 2 types of static and dynamic, meaning one and onboard or offboard as well. So the same thing. Task 1 on crane operator training. This task should be completed in order to pass. Any student not performing this portion of the test constitute the failure of the course. Each student will do a full walk around the crane, check for deficiencies. Task 2 talks about hand signals, radio protocol, operator use correct function for signal given. Again, we didn't list all the tasks. I just gave you a few examples of what the tasks were. Task 3, just like I talked about earlier, do you know the difference in an onboard static lift, or do you know the difference in an offboard dynamic lift? And then that you would actually perform a blind lift. At least one lift in each scenario must be done, meaning that they would have to know how to use the load chart to do it, or a blind lift. So here's the front side of the crane operator card. Again, it was just company logo in the left-hand corner. That was a misprint on that. So it'll just be company logo and this information. There's the back side of the card. As you can see, we wrote no history of disabling medical condition. They would actually have to check that off, and any corrective lens is required. So that was another deal. And then the type of crane you're qualified to operate, you would either be friction, which is the mechanical, or non-mechanical, hydraulic or electrical. And we put a tracking number in case somebody wanted to have that to be able to track it. Inspector training. Inspector training was another major piece of the puzzle because it was very short, probably a 1 page in the 6th edition compared to maybe what should be covered in the 7th edition. We got into a lot more detail on the qualified crane inspector, just like we did on the rigger and the crane operator. So qualified inspector is one who is designated by the employer who by reason of appropriate experience and training has successfully completed classroom type training on crane maintenance and troubleshooting, on hoist troubleshooting and overhaul, and on the structure aspects of offshore cranes, which gives knowledge of structurally critical components and critical inspection areas. Very heated topic, inspector qualifications. It is not a requirement for a qualified inspector to be a qualified operator. The 5th and 6th edition had this in it. We had several people that wanted to change that the inspector, qualified inspector, had to be a qualified crane operator, and the group decided that we would leave that a qualified inspector does not have to be a qualified crane operator. However, the qualified inspector cannot sit in the seat of the crane or operate the crane. So there are several drilling companies that were very adamant about they have qualified inspectors that they put a crane operator with to operate the crane while they're doing their inspections. So we left that alone, very heated topic, but we also left it as that you didn't have to be a crane operator to be a crane inspector. So it is recommended that the training elements for the inspector training program be tailored to the particular crane type in which the inspector is qualified. Same deal if you're going to be operating a mechanic, or if you're going to be inspecting a mechanical crane, you should be trained on a mechanical crane. If you're going to be inspecting a hydraulic crane, then you should be trained from the inspector portion on a hydraulic crane. If you're going to be inspecting an electrical crane, you should be trained specifically on an electrical crane. So that's a major change from what we had before, because if somebody went through a qualified crane inspector course per the 6th edition, it covered all types of cranes according to API. So that's a major change. Training outline for the inspector of a review of API Spec 2C, and naturally we didn't put, I don't believe, latest edition, because to be a qualified crane inspector, you have to understand every edition of 2D based on the cranes that are out there. We wrote 2C. Review of Spec 2D, naturally that would be the latest edition of 2D. Critical component identification, some of those load charts, information charts, checking them, making sure they're configured to the crane correctly. Importance of following manufacturer's recommendations, safety factors, hoist winches, structural aspects of offshore cranes, structural critical components, and critical inspection areas. Recognized applicable regulatory compliance, we talked about that, basic knowledge of NDE, typical records that must be reviewed and maintained, and repair records of completion. physical world of hydraulics, hydraulic terminology, transmission of force and energy, simple hydraulic systems, basic hydraulic symbols, basic hydraulic schematic drawings, hydraulic fluid operation at the suction side of pump, actuators, knowledge of hoses. Again, this is all added information that was not in the 6th edition. More electrical symbols, schematic drawings, basic electric terminology, this tied to the electrical cranes. Hook motor, hook board and components, swing motor, swing board and components, boom motor, control panel and operation, mechanical terminology, swing lock and brake, vertical swing shaft, this is some mechanical stuff, upper and lower reduction shafts, planetary and planetary brakes, clutch assemblies, front and rear drum brakes, boom hoist pawl, boom hoist brake, chain case pump, speedomatic, bearing, gear, shaft and housing inspection, minimal practical exercises from mechanical and non-mechanical or types of swing assemblies typically used on pedestal-mounted cranes, emergency load lowering, crane safety systems, wire rope. Those were all the added information. And then the same for crane inspector training. Again, you would have the information to follow to be able to do a crane inspector card. This would be the front side, and this would be the back side of the crane inspector card. The corrective lenses are on there, but not particularly necessary because you don't have to be a crane operator to be a crane inspector. So, and that's it. So I'll be available for the questions afterwards.
Presenting on APIU's training requirements for API RP2D is Caroline Loba, Training Associate for the American Petroleum Institute.
This leads me to the current RP2D course requirements for APIU. As of July 1st, 2015, we are now requiring 2 days for rigger and 2 days for crane operator training. That would break down to be 1 day classroom and 1 day hands-on. Recently, I've been asked why we've increased the requirement to 2 days. And with the amount of information published in Annex H in 7th edition, as well as the final recommendation from the last TPCP committee meeting to change from 8 hours to 16 hours for both crane and rigger, we felt that the increase in requirement would benefit the industry as we are finding there is room for improvement. However, we are also going to allow a 1 day, 8 hour refresher course. This would fulfill the every 4 year training requirement as long as the training is on the same edition. So for the future of APIU and RP2D, as a response to the feedback we received in regards to the requirements, the training department and the standards department in API will be working together, and we're going to assemble a task force. We're going to take Annex H and work on a document for training requirements. While Annex H is a great resource, we feel this might need to be a separate document. The specifics aren't finalized, but we would like to gather a group for this by September 1st. So if you're interested in joining this group, please see me after the session.
We now move on to our question and answer session.
I see that in one of the power slides that you're referring to the 3rd edition for the temporary crane. Is that the cutoff?
This discussion went on for the full 4 years for temporary cranes. That people were very adamant about it meeting the latest edition of 2C. That people were very adamant about it being in the middle somewhere. We chose 3rd edition at a minimum because it was in effect in 1995. It included the static and dynamic load charts, lifting capacity, and it included the safety systems for the anti-two blocks and the high boom angle. That's basically why we came to that decision for picking the 3rd edition as a minimum. Now they can meet later editions, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th if they have them, but we couldn't see forcing all temporary cranes to meet the latest edition, 7th edition of 2C.
Is that the applicable for the standard to apply to that crane? Like if we have a quote-unquote crane by definition of the 7th edition with a working load limit of less than 10,000 pounds, would it apply to the standard?
That's a vessel-mounted crane. Basically, it's a crane on a vessel, not a platform.
Okay, I sent some clarification, thank you.
One other thing that was mentioned that you guys want to pay special attention to, the 7th edition being adopted, what JR said about the idle crane. There's a lot of people in production that have idle cranes that do just annual inspections. It pretty well states that if it sits 3 months, you'll need to do a monthly. So currently that's not the case. So, and one other thing that was real important that we argued for 4 years about was cable. That as an operator, you must have a cable policy in place, meaning if you don't have a crane maintenance program, you need to get one, and if you do have one, you need to add in that you have a cable policy. We argued from 1 year to 3 years to 4 years, and we agreed not to put a year policy. So that was important as well.
Is that part of all the wire rope changes? Because I know there was a lot added around the maintenance section of that.
Yeah, that's the section that JR wrote about where the crane owner will determine a crane or a wire rope policy. So you need to make sure that you have a wire rope policy.
Yeah, we avoided putting a date down that you have to replace the wire rope, what intervals you have to replace it. It's up to the owner to make that determination.
Yeah.
Or on condition. Basically, he can just have one, we can put down that he wants to change it on condition. But it has to, that should be his policy, whatever his policy states.
There were so much differences in drilling duty compared to construction duty, compared to differences. We had, some people had 1 year policies, some people had 3 year policies, some people had 5 year policies, some people had standing rope policies, some people had running rope policies. So again, you need to look at your fleet of cranes, you need to look at what you're doing and make sure that you as the crane owner determine what's best for you. But you must have a policy, according to 7th edition, if you're going to follow that.
There's also, if an operator has he can't make his mind, our engineering department can take your crane and basically build a policy with your crane, the way designed. Basically, we can do it on the cranes we manufacture to tell you what the wire rope policy should be, but it's still up to the owner to make that call.
Well, it actually states, go back to the crane manufacturer as well. If you have a set of cranes, you may want to go back to the manufacturer and let them help you build that.
So one of the last slides talked about load sensor accuracy. Does it define what accuracy means? Am I within 3% or 5 or 20? What is accuracy?
Basically, just to verifying that if you have a load indicator, it should be the tolerances. Basically, the manufacturer of the load cells can tell you the tolerance is probably 1.5 to 2%. But it's basically, if you pull in 5,000 pounds with the load indicator, the dynamometer should read close to 5,000 pounds.
Yeah,
if it's close, we're in the same ballpark. If you pull in 10,000, it's reading 5, we know we got a big problem.
So I'm supposed to go back to the manufacturer for percent of accuracy.
Yes.
So if I'm outside of that range, then it's deficient equipment, right?
Right.
That is correct.
Yeah, but most of the vendors, basically your service providers, will know what the accuracy is on a Martin Decker unit or either electronic unit, and they're pretty close.
Good question. Any other questions? All right, can we give a hand to Mr. JR and David for presenting that?
Thank you for tuning in to the API RP2D webcast on operation and maintenance of offshore cranes. To view this webcast again, or for more information, please visit the website www.api.org/API Global Webcasts.